My name is James Glenn, and I'm from the chairperson of the Mossmorran Action Group, and we'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to come along tonight. Now, the Mossmorran Action Group has been set up 2 years ago as a resident-led campaign to get redress from the issues created by ExxonMobil and Shell at the Mossmorran plant. At the moment, we're currently sitting at over 2,300 plus members, and we have over 350 public reports of social and health impacts. And through that time, we've been engaging with politicians at councillor level, at the MSP level and MP level, and tonight is part of this further engagement to give people, the residents, a chance to speak to their candidates in Parliament and find out what their views are and how they're going to represent local interests at Westminster. There's a couple of thanks I'd like to give first. We have Jamie Fay, Burglars Dug Films. He's going to put together the film for tonight and make this publicly available on YouTube. And we've been lucky to be able to get the Courier political editor, Paul Malik, to host tonight. And it's been great. I'll allow Paul to introduce the candidates to you. So thank you all for coming.
And thank you very much for allowing me to come and host your hustings. As mentioned, my name is Paul. I am the Courier's political editor, but this is very much your event. We're going to start off with some questions once the candidates have introduced themselves, and then I'm going to take questions from the audience. If you have a question, please put your hand up and we'll try and get a working microphone to you so you can ask your question. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce, just from left, my right to left, Scott Rutherford from the Greens.
Hello everyone. Is that on? Hello? Hello? That's fine, I'll just speak. Oh, there. Okay. Yep. I think it's okay. I just need to, I'll hold it really close. Yep. Hello everyone, I'm Scott Rutherford, the Scottish Green candidate for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath. Thanks for having me along. I'm sure there's nothing you would rather be doing on a Friday night than grilling your politicians, so thank you very much for coming. We're here today because Boris Johnson has called a general election. He's gambled on getting a majority, just as Theresa May did in 2017, to ram through a Brexit deal that nobody seems to like, never mind the public, his own party. Every election, whether people want it or not, it's about general issues, whether it's local or national. It's about issues. And these things evolve to be so much more than the presumed referendum we expect them to be. The constitutional relationships of the country are hugely important right now, but there are so many issues that matter locally to people every single day in their lives, and that's what we've endeavoured to do in our campaign, is to bring those issues front and centre that no one else seems to be talking about. They affect people's lives, and they do matter in the context of a general election. This campaign has it's been bringing about those local issues into the realm of discussion. As Greens, this means issues like Mossmorran coming up in Cowdenbeath, the decline of the local high street in Kirkcaldy, lack of green investment in yards at Bifab and Burnt Island are all hugely significant. Unaffordability of homes, crisis in the care sector across Fife. We want to deliver on all those. For us, this election has been about promoting a Green New Deal for Fife. An economic package that simultaneously addresses the climate crisis by trying to get us to net zero emissions by 2030 and providing the good unionised jobs in a just transition that people need. Communities like Cowdenbeath, Kelty, Kirkcaldy, Dysart, Lochore, when industry ended here in the 80s onwards, they were left behind, they were left to rot. They've never recovered in some ways, and these working class communities don't deserve to be left behind again when we make that transition to a green economy. So that's what I'm standing up for. I'm asking you all to vote Green on December the 12th for a Green New Deal for Fife, for industry, for jobs, and to safeguard our future. Thanks very much.
Good evening, I'm Tim Brett. I'm representing the Liberal Democrats here tonight. I'm sorry our candidate is not here tonight. A vote for the Liberal Democrats in next week's election is a vote to stop Brexit and to stop independence, so that we can build a brighter future by tackling climate change and investing in mental health and in childcare. We are a growing party. We've had lots of new members join us, over the last few months, and we've got growing support, including in the last European elections, where we beat the Tories and Labour in Scotland. And we're going to win more seats in this election. There's a better way to stop Brexit. We speak for millions of people across the country who want to stop Brexit across the UK. That campaign is growing in strength with protests, marches and petitions. We were the first party to call for a second referendum, and I'm pleased that the SNP and subsequently joined us, and Labour are also offering that too. You don't need to cut and run with independence and repeat the mistakes of Brexit. We can build a brighter future on mental health, childcare and climate change if we stop Brexit and independence. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Leslie Laird, and I'd like to say thank you very much for hosting tonight's event. My focus and remarks are really about the basis of why this has been called. It's the Mossmorran Hustings. And in this election, I would therefore urge you to vote for the candidate who has demonstrated a positive track record in terms of taking on this issue, which, when I was standing for election, you raised with me. And in the first week of that election, it really opened up a catastrophic sequence of events that I think we've been fighting ever since. But whether it's on Mossmorran, or whether it's on rail or trains or Edinburgh flight paths, the Waspy Women cause, as well as miners' pensions, fighting poverty and also universal credit, bank closures and also bank fraud, whatever the issue, I have been on your side and I have had results as a result of that. On Mossmorran, on day one, I've been on your side. I had literally been elected when the flaring started that first week, and my mailbox quite literally filled up. My mailbox quite literally filled up with so many issues and complaints about the situation that was happening in the local community. But make no mistake, while Mossmorran may contribute very positively to the economic environment here, it does not give them the right to be a bad neighbour. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the last 2.5 years is that they have been not a particularly good neighbour. They've got away with that for far too long, and I decided that we needed to do something about it. And that is why I think it's important that we do not let things slip away that we have built on over the last 2.5 years. Since I was first elected, I've taken up that cause. I formed the Mossmorran Action community group. I've worked with community groups all across the constituency. I've worked with the agencies themselves, bringing the regulators to the table. I've brought the two companies to the table. I've also brought the Health and Safety Executive to the table. So in all these regards, for the first time, we have all the key people who need to be at the table to actually look at, understand and resolve those issues. Unfortunately, there is one stakeholder that has not yet shown up in the way that we would like them to, which is the Scottish Government, in relation to the calls for an independent review, particularly, I think, on the back of the health and safety report that has come out from Fife. It raises further concerns, and we have now asked the Minister 3 times to initiate an independent inquiry, and that has been refused. In relation to the results, I want to also pay tribute to my co-chair, Professor Sibbett, who had co-chaired the event with me through these last 2.5 years. But I believe that in this election, it's important to continue that continuity, and therefore I believe it's important to ensure that you have an MP who will keep the pressure up on these local issues. But it's not just on the big things that are important in this election. It's also about the things that happen to people every day all across this constituency. It's the issues with universal credit. It's the issues that people have in terms of housing, and just the sheer abject poverty that is inflicting so many people in this constituency. I've been a very visible MP. I've had surgeries every week in my local office, as well as pop-up events all across the constituency. I've also had the privilege of working for you in these last 2.5 years, and I'm asking you tonight to ask for your support on December the 12th so that we continue the work that we started and we can continue to hold the Mossmorran plants to account on your behalf. Thank you.
I'll give it a go. Hi, my name is Neil Hanvey. I'm standing as an independent in this election as a result of recent events. This election is not really about me, and it's not really about any political party. It's fundamentally about the right to choose a future that the people of Scotland want. And we are being told what we are not allowed to do, but we're also being told that we will just have to take the judgment from Westminster as to which course our future will follow. There's a call for, as people have mentioned, the second referendum on the EU membership. Scotland doesn't need a second referendum on EU membership. We've made our position incredibly clear. What we need is a second referendum on independence. And whether you are in favour of independence or you're against it, we should have that opportunity to make a choice, to choose whether we want to be pulled down with the Brexit disaster that is set to befall us under Boris Johnson, or we want to chart a different path. Brexit has already left the Scottish economy and businesses at risk of recession. There are around 130,000 jobs across Scotland that are dependent on our relationship with the EU, and they will be at risk if we have any deal, good deal, Boris deal, bad deal, Corbyn deal. They all put those jobs at risk. The problems that Scotland face are not just relating to Brexit, of course, because we have had Tory policies such as universal credit, bedroom tax, and policies that have driven poverty in a way that we've never seen before. And they are being imposed on Scotland by a Tory party that we don't vote for regularly. And that was helped by the Lib Dems. And the spending and welfare decisions were enabled by the Labour Party, who sat on their hands through those votes. So they all bear responsibility in making austerity a living nightmare for people. So we have a situation where the social fabric of Scotland is affected by these policies. And we also are now looking at our very way of life being affected, where things like health and safety, food standards, and our environmental standards, which is very important for this event this evening, are all at risk of being diluted or minimised. And so that's a really fundamental part of the choice. But I think the most important thing for me is our NHS. I trained in Fife originally at the Vic. I had a very successful career as a specialist cancer nurse. And I know that the reality of not having access to expert treatment because you don't have the right insurance or your coverage isn't good enough. In the States, those data are not collected in the cancer survival statistics because those people don't get registered. They just die. And that's the reality of a private NHS that's supported by private insurance. You never get full coverage. If you've got a dog or a pet and you go to the vets, you know you don't get 100% of that coverage cost. So there's a real issue here. And across all of those different domains, I would say that is our way of life is at risk. Our very way of life is at risk. And so whether you're in favour of staying in a Brexit Britain or whether you're in favour of independence, I would hope that everyone would agree that we deserve the right to have a choice.
Thank you. I'm Kathleen Leslie. I am the candidate for the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. My priorities in this election, first of all, no to a second independence referendum. Our trade with the rest of the UK is 4 times that of our trade with Europe. I'm absolutely clear on that as a candidate. I will always oppose a second independence referendum. Secondly, I want to see Brexit get done. The UK as a whole voted for Brexit. I want us to get on with it. Increasingly, the message that I'm hearing on the doorsteps, and that's also from people who voted yes in 2014, is we need to get Brexit done and we need to move on from that. I'm absolutely clear on that as your candidate. My other priority is I'm very much interested in local issues across the constituency. I've been a Fife councillor for 2.5 years now, representing Burnt Island, Kinghorn and Western Kirkcaldy. Throughout those 2.5 years, I have been out and about every single week, speaking to local people, addressing local issues that affect them. Here, I understand that this is a much wider area. This is the Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath constituency. And if I was elected, I would also be looking at the local issues that concern people across the whole constituency, which incidentally is what I've been doing over the past few weeks as I have been moving around the constituency speaking to people. I'm well aware of that Mossmorran is very high on the priority list for people that are living in this part of the constituency. I would like to point out that as a councillor, there are 2 parts of my ward where this issue has come up, which is in Auchtertool and also at Burnt Island, where it has come up at community council meetings. Anytime it's been mentioned, I have addressed it. If I was elected, I would be working with local groups. I'd be working with local community councils and residents groups and other people who live in the constituency. Thank you.
Sorry. Well, that's me there for the rest of the evening. The first question comes from Shona Patterson. Is Shona in the audience this evening? Okay, I'll read it out. Why is it when environmental pollution is at the forefront of news everywhere, Mossmorran is allowed to continually spout poisons into the atmosphere? Kathleen, if you'd like to answer first.
Thank you. I think that environmental protection is on everybody's list of things that are important. Now, what I do understand is that in terms of Mossmorran, there has been interaction with the Health and Safety Exec, with NHS Fife, and it is something that is being addressed.
Yeah, well, I think the place to start there is what is the scientific evidence that supports the assertion that it's spouting poisons into the atmosphere. And whilst I'm not making excuses in any way whatsoever for any contamination that does come out of a plant, clearly with the flaring, it's been a grave concern in the communities around here about what is actually coming out. Now, the data that we've got on that from the NHS Fife assessment is that there are no attributable factors that they've picked up. But one of the things that's really interesting from their literature review of the issue is that there's no studies that in existence that look at the impact of flaring and whether that is an issue. So there's clearly something that needs to be done to look at that. But just pick up on a point that was made a moment ago, which is that before calling for a further independent investigation, surely that investigation would be helped by having the final and complete reports from SEPA and the HSE, along with the report from NHS Fife. That would allow them to examine the findings from those reports, to identify key areas of examination where, like the flaring issue, where there's not sufficient evidence within the literature, and then to chart a path forward. I think that's a much more sensible way to progress, and I'm certainly not here to defend the Scottish Government, although I understand that is their position, that they want to get the data from the current investigations that are taking place, use those data to chart a course forward from there. And I think that's the way we have to lead. And I think it's absolutely incumbent on all of us to try to measure our responses to these kind of issues. And because if we talk up fear and threat, then that just causes alarm in the community, and it may be justified. And if it is justified, the data should support it. But we shouldn't alarm communities if there is no perceivable threat. And I think we need to get a balance between ensuring action's taken, but also trying to keep everybody's head clear.
Well, the Mossmorran situation is one that has been of great concern for this community. And I personally take the view that it's not a politician's role to say what is or is not a legitimate concern for a community. If people are coming and writing and raising concerns, I've seen it as my role to go and listen to what those concerns are, to understand those concerns, and to probe further as to understanding why those situations have occurred. If you look at the history of the Mossmorran plant since the last 2.5 years, there hasn't even been one single episode. There has been a catalogue of episodes. And at the last Mossmorran working group meeting that we had, it was highlighted that the word explosion was used in relation to the catastrophic boiler failure that occurred. So for all of us here, we are not walking and living every day in the shoes of people who are living in this community. And I think as politicians, our role is to listen and to better understand those concerns. And my understanding of those concerns has greatly increased over the last 2.5 years. And therefore, when you look at the series of events that have occurred, it's absolutely evident that there are systematic failures that have been occurring in various aspects of the operation of the site. I don't think it's by any sudden magnitude that they have suddenly announced. In fact, at the second meeting of our working group, the companies announced that they were going to invest over 100 and take a survey to undertake a best available technology undertaking, and have now confirmed they're going to invest 140 million. It's unclear at this point whether the replacement of the boilers that have now basically caused the plant to close for an unprecedented amount of time is part of that 140 million, or whether that is more than that. I think it's also fair to say that the health report has taken some time to come. And while the health report doesn't fully address all of the concerns, I think it's important to look at what the health report actually doesn't say. What the health report actually doesn't say is how they're collecting data when local people are turning up at their GPs or their opticians or other areas where people are raising concerns about their health and well-being. It does specifically talk about the level of sleep deprivation that people are having when these events occur. It does talk about the vibration and noise that impacts on people. So I believe if I was in government, given all of the evidence that I have seen and that the working group has seen, then I think I would definitely be wanting to make sure that there was full rigour and examination of that evidence. In relation to investigations, the investigations are still ongoing from several episodes. But I think if you worked in any other industry and you discovered that there were systematic failures at various parts of a process and there were health issues associated with that, then good practice to me would suggest that you wouldn't wait and allow things to run on for how many months we still don't know. You would intervene. You would take the action to actually understand the full picture. The plant has finally been issued with a final written warning, but that means other investigations and the more serious investigation is still ongoing. In addition to that, I think communities are still raising concerns that are simply not being fully addressed, and the health report now does require further follow-up action. I believe it is incumbent on the Scottish Minister to pull all of that evidence together, to look at that in the round, and to give the people of this community the answers that, frankly, they deserve.
I would echo a lot of what Leslie's just said. What I can say to you is that whilst I'm not from your community here, I was at the Council's Environmental Committee last week when ExxonMobil came along. I've read the NHS Fife report, and whilst ExxonMobil were at pains to say that there was no evidence of air pollution, it is absolutely clear from the NHS Fife report that there has been serious and serious health problems for people in the local community. I asked them, have you spoken with NHS Fife? And the answer was no. Not clear to me why they are scared of having a discussion. When I then asked them, with all of the investment that's going in, can you tell the community whether that's going to reduce the number of flares a year, which they said was on average 3 a year? I couldn't get an answer. I asked the question several times. All we were told was that the flaring would not be as disruptive as it's been hitherto. So I think that they're letting the community down, and there is clearly a need, and I would applaud the efforts of many in this room to hold them to account, and we should continue to do that. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry that the community's been let down so much on this issue. Clearly, it's been an issue for many years and a growing concern for people. The NHS report on the health-related impacts of living near the plant that was published around 2 months ago is clear. It has a negative impact on all those who live around it. We've had limited success in the Scottish Parliament by pressing the First Minister and ExxonMobil and Shell to close over the Christmas period. It's a concession. It's the minimum that people should expect at the time of year they want to be cosy, comfortable with their families, to not have an ethylene cracker burning off excess gas into the air. We've had very limited success on that so far, 3 days in the Christmas period when we were hoping for 3 weeks, or 2 weeks even. As Greens, we have a lot to say on this. I certainly think that an independent inquiry commissioned by the Scottish Government would be a start to addressing it. But this is bigger than just what happens here. I mean, tied to what happens at Mossmorran is the whole supply chain of North Sea gas and oil. The future of the plant's entirely bound up at the future of North Sea oil production. Climate science has repeatedly shown that we cannot continue to extract and burn fossil fuels if we're to achieve net zero emissions in the early part of this century. Further up the gas line, as it's piped down, further up the gas line, the excess gas is used to heat homes in places near Aberdeenshire. A mass programme to retrofit our housing stock with electric and biomass alternatives, heat pumps, district heating schemes, etc., will help us to gradually turn off North Sea oil supply, eventually making the plant at Mossmorran redundant. The integrated nature of this shows why a Green New Deal is so important. We can't begin to address the issues like pollution from Mossmorran until we've invested heavily in alternatives, which in turn creates jobs through things like home retrofitting programmes. The Greens are the only party proposing a comprehensive plan, and that comprehensive plan is the only way we'll address the issue. It's bigger than just what happens here. And we as Greens think that this is the way it goes, has to be addressed now. We cannot keep kicking this into the long grass. The community have had enough.
The Tory candidate to expand on her answer to that question, please. She said the issue's been addressed. How is it being addressed?
I didn't say it's addressed in the past tense, I said it's currently being addressed.
Yes,
by,
being addressed. How is it being addressed?
Well, in terms of working with the Health and Safety Exec, with NHS Fife, and I think that what is important throughout this is that the plant is liaising with local groups and getting that feedback from local groups as well as looking at the report from NHS Fife.
So are you quite heavily involved then in pressing for this?
As a councillor, up until now, the part of my ward where any time it's come up has been Ocker Tool, which has been limited in that sense, but when it's come up, I have asked questions of ExxonMobil.
Hi, my name is Linda Erskine. I'm a local constituent here. I would like to ask a question, Neil Hanvey. Neil, you said that you would hope that all the investigations would be concluded before they had an independent inquiry. So could you tell me why Joanna Cherry then announced at the Hustings that we had on televised last week that the Scottish Government have agreed to have an independent inquiry now? Given that it has been refused 5 times, I was quite astonished to hear that, and it'll be very welcome if that's the case.
Sorry, is that an independent? Well, if it's only been released in the last week or so, that information, I may not have been made aware of it. So it's a welcome step. I still think that even if there is an inquiry, the reports from HSE and SEPA and NHS Life are going to be absolutely essential to give any inquiry a basis on which to start to set out the scope, look where the gaps of information are, and also to measure that against the numerous complaints that are covered in the NHS Fife report from the community. You know, you can't people, oh no, your experience isn't valid. What you need to be able to do is try and find an explanation for it. One of the biggest concerns that has, and I think probably one of the most frightening issues, is the concern about higher incidence of cancer in the area. Now, that's something that is has been looked at in detail going back as far as 2002 and forward. And they've looked at all of the different variants in that. Sorry, do you not want me to talk about that, Linda?
No, I was saying, as a resident that used to go to the community council, regularly getting health reports, James, you were in the community council at the time, we regularly had feedback saying that there was nothing attributable, but the reality is that there was no real investigation into the health studies that were needing done when that was flaring. So you have a report, but unless it's linked directly to all the incidents that have come back, not just 2.5 years.
Yeah, and that would be something. So that would be something that the independent inquiry would be able to do. What I'm commenting on is that all of the epidemiology studies that have been taken looking at cancer incidents have found that there's no greater incidence in this area versus Fife, and Fife versus the rest of Scotland. And one of the confounding factors in that is that the issue of multiple deprivation has got an imbalance in effect. So that's a standard way to look at the epidemiology of cancer incidents. So, you know, I'm just telling you what that is, but it would be great if there's going to be an investigation. That's fantastic. I mean, I think that's what everybody wants, but it's just that it's better to have that based on the information that's available.
Is it switched on? Yes. I've got a question for Mr. Hanvey. Have you actually spoken to SEPA or to the HSE so that you know what they're investigating? SEPA is only investigating breaches of the licence, which is again, very limited really in terms of what Exxon and Shell are allowed to flare off. It's a tiny slice of what people here experience as impact. HSE is only looking at the breakdowns, the things that nearly caused the plant to blow up. Nothing to do with impacts. There is absolutely no reason why the Scottish Government could not tomorrow launch an inquiry into the impacts. They are hiding behind HSE and SEPA, and the fact is there keep on being so many incidents that their investigations never end, because as soon as one ends, there's another incident and a new investigation. People want answers, and they want thorough studies of the impacts. That health report that came from NHS Fife was pathetic. It used as its data complaints to SEPA. People phone up SEPA to complain about environmental impacts. They don't phone up SEPA because they've got a sore throat or they can't sleep. They might mention that in passing and SEPA wrote it down. That was the data that the NHS report used. And even then they concluded there were significant health impacts. It's pathetic. The cancer data, that everybody who lives here is convinced that there is a spike in cancer deaths here. It didn't show up in the epidemiological studies because they are methodologically flawed because they took too large sample areas and they weren't done properly. People think there's a cover-up, and it is time this was looked at and stopped being kicked into the long grass.
I mean, I think these are really at the issues that the local community feel is just not being addressed. If you look at even the role of SEPA, initially they didn't have enough resources and equipment to actually monitor what was happening at the time when incidences were occurring. There has been some movement of resources to allow SEPA to get more data. But the challenge is there is no real baseline evidence. And the point that we would be making through the independent inquiry is to start to baseline that data. So, for example, we're not asking GPs in this area to report when people are coming and reporting incidences that they feel are attributed to the flaring episodes. They're not being asked to capture sleep deprivation data, for example, is absolutely prevalent through these episodes. So to say there is no need for an independent inquiry just flies in the face of the concerns of the community and the fact that there is no baseline data. Until you start to go and benchmark what's actually happening, how can you possibly know? And that is the point. It has not been properly investigated, and the processes are taking too long because, frankly, the Executive, Health and Safety Executive and SEPA simply do not have enough resources. I have also asked the Minister to improve the resources for SEPA. If we want to monitor and assess these things correctly, that's what we need to do. I would also just like to say, just adding in from Scott's point, the Labour Party also has a full manifesto on where we believe we are going with Green Deal and climate change. We have a comprehensive policy that has been set out on that, and a 250 billion transformation fund. It's there, have a read at it. It's thorough, it's comprehensive, it's been put together by experts from all across the country, and we're ready to roll with that if we're elected as Labour government.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back. I mean, I understand the concern, but I don't understand perhaps the reaction to a confirmation that there is going to be an independent inquiry. You know.
Yeah, it was said on our podcast. The Minister hasn't confirmed it.
Right. Well, you know. I don't report to the minister. You know, I have no direct link to the minister at present, and I would support a public inquiry. I've not prevaricated on that at all. I mean, it needs to happen. I just think that you need to get the sequencing right, and so that inquiry has the baseline that Leslie's talking about to look for the gaps in data. That's what I have said consistently.
My name is Anthony Craig. I'm a councillor for Fife Council, a Labour councillor, just to get that out there first. I'd like to ask all the candidates the same question. I think that would probably be more helpful. Fife Council's policy is that we should be looking for a strategic programme for the decommissioning of the plant and compensation for the communities around it. In simple terms, do you agree with our policy? And I think just on the Joanna Cherry thing, I think she may have misspoken because she's not notified the council yet. We'll leave that where it lives because we've had a few goes. But do you agree with the policy and will you support it?
Thank you. And we'll go to Tim for that one first.
Yes, I would agree with that, but clearly a lot of the detail needs to be worked up. I'm not party to that. It was interesting on the compensation question. I know this was touched on at yesterday's council meeting. The representatives from ExxonMobil actually said at last week's meeting that they were open for people coming to raising the compensation issue with them. And I very much hope that the relevant people, yourself or David or others, will be in there quickly, because I think the community deserve that.
I'll pass on to Scott.
I'm not fully aware of the policy of the council, but in broad terms, it seems absolutely the right thing to do. There's been a massive adverse impact on this community from Mossmorran. People living in the shadow of it have felt like they are absolutely marginalised and not listened to. And it seems to me tonight that there is consensus across parties, and it's just a matter of how big a step we're willing to take. I think it needs to be more than baby steps. The reason why Mossmorran is flaring so often is because it has an excess of feedstocks coming down. We need to cease these feedstocks coming down. We're literally fueling the problem by further taking out oil and gas products from the North Sea. That has to be part of the overall aim of this. Otherwise, what's the point? We need to address the whole environmental and ecological impact, not just one part of it. I'll just add on compensation for the communities. I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. And I think it's a shame, because it'll happen, and it seems to be one of the very few things that SEPA are able to enforce. It's a rather toothless agency in that regard. People do deserve it. It's not enough. And it might feel like people are being bought off. They do deserve compensation, but they deserve so much more. They deserve to be able to live in peace in their homes. And that's the Green position. Thanks.
Thank you. In regards to the compensation, which I think Tim mentioned there, this did come up at the Fife Council meeting yesterday, and ExxonMobil did say that they were open to that, so that would be something I think that the community may be looking at if they've got any claims or looking for compensation there. In terms of strategic policy for decommissioning the plant, no, I don't agree with decommissioning the plant, not at this stage. I'm not saying that at some point in the future I would say that that would change, but at this point I don't. Still, there is the North Sea oil and gas industry that provides jobs. It provides into the UK and the Scottish economy. So no, I certainly wouldn't be. I think that over the longer term, as we move towards more green options when it comes to energy, yes, but at this point, no.
I think a strategic transition is absolutely essential. If you cast your mind back to the 80s, and I think everybody here who was living in Fife in those days of the miners' strike and the eventual collapse of the NCB, there was no transition there, and that had an absolutely devastating effect on the communities across Fife. And so we're kind of now in a similar position where we face another ideological challenge. The 80s obviously was Thatcherism and her disregard for unionised workforce and her crusade to dismantle workers' rights. And now we are faced with an ideological crusade of the Brexiteers, who really don't seem to care about the consequences of Brexit on some of the most vulnerable people in the community. We know that they don't have that concern because over the last 10 years they have punished the poor and the disabled in a way that I don't think anyone could have imagined before. So in terms of the strategic transition, there are the key point there is, well, transition to what? And what are the key issues that we need to address? So despite Scott mentioning the heating from Morrison can be generated in different ways, the plastics from the ethylene that are created in the cracker, that's a slightly more difficult challenge. Now, I'm not talking about single-use plastics. I find that one of the most frustrating parts of daily life, taking food out of plastic and chucking it in the recycling. It just seems absolutely crazy. And at the SNP conference earlier this year, I spoke on our motion about single-use plastics reduction by 2025, and I highlighted Mossmorran and its production of ethylene and the jobs that are relied upon that. Now, in Scotland, in fact in the UK, we don't manufacture any biodegradable single-use products. We import all of that. Now, if you're talking about your carbon footprint, importing something that we've got all of the raw materials to make in this country is bonkers. You know, you need potato starch to make single-use non-plastics. We've got potatoes. You need shellfish and I think it's salmon skin that they're using. There's a new technology that's been developed. We've got plenty of that. And also seaweed is another resource that can be used in the manufacture of biodegradable plastic substitutes. But there's another issue that is really important. It's an important issue not just for industry, but it's an important issue for our advancement of our economic our environmental standards, and that's if we're going to make lightweight electric vehicles, we need plastic to do that. Yeah, I will do it. Yeah, and so we've got a real challenge, ultimately. We need to take the expertise and the scientific basis of people that work in plants like Exxon and challenge them to come up with new methods of doing that moves us away from hydrocarbons.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I think it's inevitable if we look at the climate challenges that we have, that the future of Mossmorran must be something we should be starting to think about now. And that's why Labour has put forward as part of its manifesto the Just Transition. Because I can well remember, and I marched on the situation where Thatcher was in power, and the cry at that time was coal, not dole. And I can well remember that not being a situation that I would want to see replicated. I was also brought up in a shipbuilding community and could see the impact of Thatcher's policies in terms of abandoning UK shipbuilding. So absolutely, there must be a just transition. Otherwise, we will not have learned any of the lessons that we have inflicted on communities across this country, and particularly here in Scotland, by pulling out of traditional industries and leaving communities behind. And that is why it's so important that we do start to have that grown-up conversation now about what that's going to look like. That needs to engage with the oil and gas industry. There are over 300,000 people employed in that in the UK. There are 39,000 oil and gas workers within Scotland. So we do need to start having those conversations. We need to start understanding what kind of training will be required. But Labour's alternative is to move them to our green industrial revolution, because we are going to have to find alternative ways to keep the lights on, to fuel our cars, to run our economy. And that is why Labour's proposal is around expanding on and offshore wind, hydro, carbon capture, storage. All of these things have to be in the mix, but they also have to have the investment and the drive, and above all else, the political will to actually make that happen. And I think if you've got time, have a look at our proposition on that. I think you will see that it's well thought out, it has been well structured, but the time is ticking on, and we do need to start having the conversations about what that transition looks like, and we need to also put in place the opportunities for people to move into those areas, and that's what I would suggest that we need to be starting to think about now.
Thank you. So I'm afraid on my behalf, we've got one more question that we're just going to open up from the submitted questions. This is from Jamie Anderson, and I'm just going to do it in reverse order. If we're going to go Kathleen down to Scott. And is it right that ExxonMobil has taken school pupils from Fife to a pond visit on the plant site? A pond visit, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I know these visits have been going on for a number of years now. I do not believe that anybody working in the plant with the amount of health and safety regulations that we have in this country, or any of the schools that were involved in that, would have put any children at risk. So as far as I'm concerned, the plant in terms of school visits, I don't have any problem with that. Additionally, we're trying to encourage more young people to go into STEM industries, particularly girls, and that's been something that's been quite difficult. There's still a huge gap between the number of girls and the number of boys that take up STEM subjects and continue with doing that. And having Mossmorran and the work that they've actually been doing with school pupils in the pond dipping, I think that that's something that's opening up opportunities for young people to actually go and experience science. And that is something that's done in a very regulated environment. So yes, I don't have a problem with that.
I mean, it's a difficult one to answer when, I think as Leslie characterised, that Exxon are considered a bad neighbour. So it's hard, it's a bit like The Simpsons, kind of Mr. Burns character, and would you send your kids to visit Mr. Burns' plant? I think the way to deal with that is that you need to rebuild trust between the community and the plant operators. But it is important that young people who want to go into STEM industry, that they have access to that. The appropriateness, I guess, is something for review, and I'd really like to understand what the fundamental concerns are there. I just mentioned one thing that I didn't cover before, which was the compensation. I mean, I think that's quite a tough question, because you have to ask questions about, well, how are they going to compensate people, and who, and how is that calculated? I think that would require quite a bit of detailed work.
This relates to school visits to the Fife Ecology Centre, and during recent episodes of flaring, parents were expressing concern that children were still being taken to visits to carry out the pond dipping. I believe those concerns were addressed. I believe Fife Council's environmental protection team were also involved in that. But I think that just really gets to the heart of the issue that I articulated earlier, that people just feel concerned. And unless that you put the right assurances in place, then it's difficult. I think none of us would want to discourage opportunities for visits to any types of events that schools can manage to arrange. Anything that's encouraging interest in science and technology is clearly to be welcomed. But I think it really just gets to the heart that you have to ensure that parents feel comfortable that where their children are going is indeed safe. I believe there was no basis of concern around the Ecology Centre at that time. The visits are still continuing, but clearly it just gets to the heart of the anxiety that people in the community feel about the situation.
I think it's been said. I don't think you'd want me to go on about it. I'm sure there's been a proper risk assessment done, as no one would want to expose our children to any risk. I think the company, however, have got a lot of work to do to regain the trust of the community, and I hope that they will reach out to the community in all sorts of ways, as a major employer like this should be doing. So I would be pressing for them to do more of that. But I agree with what the others have said, that it's important that our youngsters in school do get an understanding of these things.
Yeah, so my mum's a classroom assistant in Kirkcaldy, and she was asked for years to accompany children along to these ExxonMobil sponsored events. She declined on the grounds that it's shamelessly exploiting little children purely as a PR exercise for ExxonMobil. Investment in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, maths, is hugely important, especially since there's such a gender disparity in people taking up those subjects. But to try and relate into convincing children on a day trip near Mossmorran that they should take up the sciences, they should take up the sciences, the technologies of the future. I just find bewildering. Invest in education if you want children to be inspired in education. Don't exploit them for a photo opportunity.
Question. Time for a couple of questions. You don't need it?
I'm a former school leader. Moved up here from down south. I do have to say, yeah, I'm a former school leader. Moved up here from down south, as you can tell. But I'll try it, but usually it doesn't work too well. I find it a bit of a problem, and you highlighted it really, that the school's risk assessment should have made that a non-starter. You know, you just wouldn't. To the lady here on the end, I hope nothing ever happens to your children, that 1 in a million thing. But as a responsible school leader, you would have done a risk assessment and said, is there somewhere else with a bit of water we could go that wasn't near a bloody great plant?
No? Okay. Come on.
Hello, I live in Dalgety Bay, and first of all I'd like to query about when you're talking about Facebook and don't wrap up a community fear. I can actually tell you the community fear is genuine and it is actually there. I live in Dalgety Bay, and my biggest problem is the fear of the domino effect. And I'm just wondering if the panel know much about the domino effect and how they can reassure me that it will not happen and what they can actually do about the actual domino effect. What do you exactly know about it? Sorry.
Scott?
I'm aware of it as a metaphor. I have no idea, sorry, what you mean about domino effect. Do you mean a knock-on effect of Mossmorran in Dalgety Bay?
And it's the life to pray. When I was in Dalgety Bay, a few months ago, when the rain was exceptionally bad, out of Dalgety Bay and my garden lit up exceptionally pink. I literally take photographs without the flash at midnight. It was that bad. And I live basically about a quarter of a mile from Braidwood Brae. And the worry is the life of the possibility of if Braidwood ever goes, Mossmorran ever goes, because in my opinion, it's just a massive pressure cooker. When a pressure cooker goes off, the steam goes off. And then that was even worse, it can explode. It's happened in America and it can happen. And the domino effect is the oil line or whatever it is, the gas line in the pipeline, straight to Braidwood Brae. So if one goes, the other can possibly go as well. That is 5, whatever's in the Forth, and whatever's in Edinburgh as well. That's a massive catastrophe that it gives a genuine fear, and I'd like that to be addressed. Hopefully, it will never happen, but the fear is fear, especially when you live in the middle of both. So that's what my
Yeah, I think concerns about your individual health, your family's health, if you're surrounded by, if you're in the shadow of Mossmorran, is absolutely everywhere. I think everyone's really concerned, and clearly this is happening as evidence has begun to It's begun to amount anyway. Clearly this does have a huge impact on people's life. To ignore that, to suggest that we kick it in the long grass is crazy. I don't have an engineering background, so I can't say a great deal about how the plant functions. When it was upgraded with £140 million, the plan to upgrade it with £140 million, I believe is just to bring it into line with safe regulations. It's not to make it super efficient. It's not to go above and beyond what people expect. It's to bring it into line with that. When 2 of the 3 boilers broke, that are part of the cooling down process, and I believe it's chemical distillation. When they broke, I believe there was huge problems with the plant, and it had to be shut down immediately. This is tricky because when oil's being piped, when gas is being piped down, they can't turn it off. It takes days for that process to end. I don't want to be a sensationalist at all. I couldn't say a thing about explosions. If I'm being honest, I couldn't say a thing. But I think it's such a huge concern for people around. And Mossmorran is not the future of jobs here. In this £140 million that's being pledged, I think there's something like 800 jobs have been promised. Okay, they're jobs, but that's a trickle in the ocean. And these are going to be part-time short-term jobs. They are not investments in the future. The jobs of the future are in yards like BIFAB. Green manufacturing is where we need to go with this. I'm very conscious that I'm on a panel here with what I believe are 4 former and current Fife councillors. Now, all their pensions in the Fife Fife pension fund, they go towards investments in oil companies and fossil fuel companies and weapons companies. Now that's billions of pounds, and it's hundreds of millions that are put into these huge, risky investments against a safe future. I think it's amazing to me that this just doesn't seem to be much of an issue for councillors. I've overlooked them, and some of them are certainly very hard workers for the community. But clearly this can't continue.
Go ahead. On our superannuations committee, we do everything through all the highest level of corporate governance, and our investments are based on these things. We do have a whole set of parameters. I think you've done us no favours at all. You've done us no favours at all with the way you've besmirched the reputation of the people who invest in our pension fund. You shouldn't do that. You don't have any facts on that. I think that's a very poor move to do.
No, I'm sorry. You do not control the investments. I'm not blaming you at all. I believe the fund managers have the final say, and it's their fiduciary responsibility. I think we might.
Can I just tidy that up? Sorry, you're right. The fund managers invest on our behalf. We control the policy that decides what they invest in through all of the social, environmental, and governance issues. You cannot sit there and besmirch the council's pension scheme without facts, and I would recommend you don't.
I think there's a huge potential there. These are held by regulations in Westminster. There's a huge potential for that fund to go to green manufacturing. I'm not suggesting that the councillors can necessarily change this. It's down to the fund manager's discretion. I'm not saying the councillors have done nothing. I'm saying there's a potential that we can do something. Fiduciary responsibility is ultimately what it comes down to for the fund manager. Some local authorities pension funds have invested and some haven't. And from what I'm aware of, I think we have potential too. I'm trying to propose a positive solution here. I'm not just having the money.
I think we'll go back to the question, which was how do we deal with?
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah. I think we'll go back to the original question of how we deal with the domino effect and the fears that residents are raising. If we could just stay on topic, that would be marvellous. We'll pass it on to Tim. Thank you.
I'm struggling to answer your question because I don't know enough. I'm not an engineer either, although I did work for Scotland's main health protection agency. I would like to think, and I actually believe that that ExxonMobil, despite all the criticisms we've heard tonight, would not be running a plant that was that dangerous. But I totally get the possibility of the domino effect that you described, okay? But I totally understand your concern and the much wider concern of everybody in the community, and that does need to be addressed. But I just echo what others have said, that we should be looking to invest in newer green technologies. There was a report this week from the Scottish Parliament saying that it's transportation that's the biggest emitter of carbon. We've got 10 years only now to fix this. We can't all go on driving around as we are in our petrol and diesel cars. There's a whole host of things we need to be investing in. Like Leslie has said, my party wants to invest in those things, and it's urgent. And I hope that all of us, in fact, could get behind that.
Well, I think I would recognise what you're saying, because you don't have to live right in the proximity. I think when the flaring has happened, particularly in that episode in June, I mean, it could be seen for miles. People in Edinburgh were commenting about it. And in fact, one of the BBC journalists who has continued to cover this story did so as a result of seeing that episode of flaring. But I think it comes back to my original point, which is there are concerns from the community that are simply not being addressed. And until such times as those concerns can be addressed and that benching mark can be taken, that people can be reassured, then people will just be anxious. And I think therefore it is important that we do have the independent investigation. And I look forward, if Joanna Cherry is correct, that the Minister has agreed to that, then I'm sure we can all look forward to seeing when that's going to take place, and also what are the terms of reference for that investigation, because I think we're hearing a number of issues and it would be good to see that. In relation to the pensions issues, I know a number of councils and companies are becoming increasingly aware that they need to diverse their investments. And I'm sure that that is something, just as we've talked about just transition in terms of jobs, I think it's also about just transition in terms of how people move money from pensions, because you don't want to jeopardise the pensions of the people who that you've employed. So it is about recognising that things are changing and putting a plan in place to make sure that that's done in a sensible way, because otherwise you may end up people lose their pension because things have been moved in the wrong way too quickly. So there's a real balance to be struck for all of us in terms of the decisions that we're going to have to make as we go through this transition. And there are huge lifestyle changes on all of us that we are all going to have to embrace. And that is the whole culture shift that the climate emergency has now brought on all of us. So I think it's about understanding what are those interconnected parts, that domino effect, as you've touched on, because they cover a whole magnitude of things. And I think it's about being sensible in our approach and understanding we can't fix everything at once, but we focus on the things we need to fix first of all. And there's some priorities I think we would all agree on that we can already see, as Tim's touched on, heating and obviously transport being the biggest of that. That comes back to you have to invest in public transport, and you have to look at the fact that here in Fife we've had bus routes cut, and we've had poor train services. So if we're trying to make that transition, one of the things we have to do is get more people onto public transport. But to do that, you have to invest, and you also have to invest in green buses. So it's really starting to break down each of those individual areas and saying, how are we going to do it? What's the policy behind it? But more importantly, what's the investment to make that transition work effectively?
Thanks, Ellen. I completely understand the concern that a catastrophic failure could result in a significant event. And I think when you're dealing with anything like this, any environmental risk, whether it's nuclear or petrochemical, you always have to plan for that. That's an absolutely essential part of any risk management. What is the worst that could happen and how do we prevent it? And so you work back from what's the worst that could happen, and then you do all of your mitigating actions, and that will be, I would assume, not an engineer, but I would assume that would be having various valves and systems to stop any spread. Now, I'm not saying that they're there, that's what I would assume. I'm not an engineer. So I think that it's a really important question. It's one of the issues I raised with Exxon when I went to meet with them, which was about how do they explain what they do and how they make sure that the plant is safe to the community in a way that's helpful. How do they do that? How do they reach out and build that trust? And I guess it's going to take a bit of time because that sense of trust has clearly been reached. But that's, you know, we looked at one of their draft infographic kind of video things and made several suggestions of information that was either absent or would be helpful. And I think that process needs to continue, and I would hope that they would be helpful in that way. You know, some people will say you're being alarmist, but the reality is it's not, because it's always possible. I mean, if you just, all you have to do is look at Fukushima, okay? No, it's never going to be a problem, and now it's a major problem. I don't think we're looking at anything on that scale because thankfully we're not fracking in Scotland, so the earthquake risk is down. But that would be an issue for me if there was fracking happening in that area. Well, what's the impact on underground pipes? And so there are lots of things to be considered. But it fundamentally is they need to have robust practices and they need to explain that to reassure people like yourself.
Thank you. I also live in Dalgety Bay. I grew up in Dalgety Bay. I am aware of the fact that one of the beaches that I used to play on, and many of my friends did, has still got radioactive particles on it, which we've been promised now for over a decade that are going to have been cleaned up. But so far that's not happened. So I am very much aware of when you're talking about the domino effect. In terms of Braefoot Bay, there's an exclusion zone around that on both sides between Dalgety Bay and Aberdour. I know that area very well. I walk along it, cycle along it regularly, so I am aware when you're talking about that domino effect there. I think really what this comes back to is that the plant needs to be communicating better with communities, and I think there's been a lot of focus in terms of Mossmorran and probably not actually so much in terms of Braefoot Bay. That may be because Braefoot Bay does not actually flare, but obviously the gas pipeline is running down there. So I think perhaps one of the things is the plant maybe needs to engage a little bit better with community councils such as Dalgety Bay and Aberdour Community Council. There's some work I know that's being carried out down there at the moment, and I know that the community councils were made aware of that. I'm hoping that message has gone out to the wider community. I have to say I've not actually seen that myself, but I think it comes back to better communication to ensure that people do feel reassured and that any questions they have are being answered. But I fully do understand your concerns because I live in Dalgety Bay as well.
How would you, God forbid, and Mossmorran does happen to go, and is what that can happen, obviously. What is the guarantee that there will not be a domino effect? Is it safety procedures already in place, or again, it's the fact that no one's ever asked that kind of question?
I could actually answer that. It's in the emergency coma plan that something in Mossmorran, because it's a top-tier site, it's also a criminal site, that in the hands of Mossmorran can have an knock-on effect that they could be range out and anything else on the timeline. There's nothing to prevent that, it just depends on how the engineers react to the issue at the time. So, the only thing I can do is that there is an emergency response plan to bring in.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. We'll answer any more questions. Hopefully this is out on Thursday's decision.
Well, if candidates are happy, we have them all about 9 o'clock, so we can't do more questions, but Paul has got another press engagement to go to. But we switch with the chair. If the candidates are happy, we continue working on more questions. We thank Paul for his time.
Hello, yes. I'd like to ask you all, yes, given the worry, the concern that we have of Mossmorran blowing up and having the knock-on domino effect, and all the concerns about pollution, Mossmorran is the second biggest polluter in Scotland. Given these concerns and the fact that we are still subsidising very much the oil and gas industry in this country, and the Conservative government has removed so many of the subsidies for things like solar, PV and all the rest, all these renewables, that they had more, we used to have more subsidies for that kind of thing, that people could become less less fossil fuel dependent. What are you going to do if you're in government to bring about that change to subsidise for renewables and taking the subsidies away from oil and gas?
Since that question had the Conservatives mentioned, we'll start for yourself, Kathleen, and work for the other end.
I don't fully accept that subsidies have been taken away from renewables, and also I know that Boris Johnson, and if there is a Conservative majority government, we will be working towards being carbon neutral by 2050, which I fully support. I also do support a move towards a more green economy. So in terms of subsidies for renewals and moving away, I certainly don't believe we can move away from the oil and gas industry at this stage. It would have to be a long-term transition from that, given the amount of jobs and the need that we still have for the economy.
Well, there we are. You know, these subsidies are really important because they're not a subsidy, they're an investment. They're an investment in moving away from hydrocarbons to, and ultimately, a much more equitable way to generate energy. Because at the moment, the power companies have a stranglehold on the cost that we pay for the energy that we use. If we approached energy in a much different way, that you'll see that happening in certain communities where they've got a wind farm nearby and they get a benefit into the community for that. That's a good example. But the reality of the situation is that these cuts and incentives for investment have had a direct impact in this constituency, because those are the kind of cuts, those are the kind of decisions that impact businesses like BiFab. Those are the things that stop that inward investment coming to Scotland, where we should be a world leader in renewable energy production, whether that's wind, wave or tidal. We should be absolutely at the forefront. And because the Westminster government decides that, well, that's not really important, it's just Scotland, then they don't really build that into their thinking about the decisions that they make. So as the most energy-rich country in Europe, we are not at the vanguard of renewable technology, and we should be. And the only way, it will be no surprise to hear from me, the only way to be able to make that investment is for us to be an independent country and to chase the opportunities that exist in and around our fantastic country.
Or the other way you can do it is to vote Labour on the 12th of December. Because at that point, you will get the investment that you need. Because I think your question is absolutely bang on. Subsidies have been cut. There's absolutely no doubt about that. If you look at the lack of investment in alternative fuels, if you look at the timid investment around things like really developing around carbon capture and storage and hydro. If you look at the whole way we have missed the opportunities in relation to off and onshore wind, BiFab being a case in point, we've got a situation here where we have the skills and the talent in this community to be delivering those orders, and yet here they are quite literally beached on the shore watching it sail by. And if rumour has it, it hasn't yet been confirmed, the contracts are not signed, we're going to get something like 8 jackets out of that. So I go back to the days of the Silicon Valley, when I spent a lot of my time working for high-tech companies that come into Scotland. We give them lots of grants and then they disappear. And unfortunately, the Scottish National Party's current policy in terms of economic development is exactly that. It is about bringing in external investment. If you look at Scottish Enterprise's role over the last 10, 15 years, it has been completely and utterly run down. Investment in their budget has been cut by huge proportions. In the last budget round, it was cut by 4.5%. In terms of investment in even growing our own businesses, which is the key part we need to do with the Scottish economy, we need to grow our own indigenous businesses, and we need to be developing and investing in those technologies here so that we can indeed take part and be part of that global market and not just be in the BiFab position where we're scratching about looking for crumbs. We need to really be on it. Business development grant for Scottish Enterprise has been cut by over 20% for small businesses. You also have to look at the lack of finance that's available through banks right now for businesses like that to get the funding that they need. And that's why Labour's policy is about this 250 billion investment for that Green Transition Fund to absolutely make sure that we can get those jobs and get that investment here. You also touched on the fact about heat being our highest level. So we have announced that we will have one of the biggest retrofit homes programmes across the UK. And that means here in Scotland that will create jobs, and that will also create a reduction in fuel poverty, which is a real issue in so many of our communities. So you don't have to wait for anything. It can all start happening on the 13th of December. So look at our agenda. It's ambitious, it's funded, it's been looked at by academics and industry experts, and we're up for it. And if you're up for it too, then make sure you elect a Labour government and get rid of Boris Johnson.
Can I try and answer the question? Yeah, I don't accept Kathleen's point about that these Conservatives have not cut back subsidies. George Osborne with the fuel tax, that's been the same since 2010. The report I referred to earlier now shows that in fact our driving is 24% cheaper than it used to be. So we're all now, you know, driving more and contributing to the problem. There was the part of the coalition set up the Green Investment Bank in Edinburgh. What's happened to that? It's gone. So I don't accept that, and I don't really believe that they are serious in tackling this. We need a massive investment, and others have said this. We need to invest in insulation. Judy Hamilton is at the back. I've been trying to persuade Judy that we really need to start building passive husis. And Councillor Noble was raising that last week. You know, if other local authorities are doing that, we need to be doing this rather than continuing to build houses where there will be sort of higher fuel bills. We need to find a way of doing that. We need to continue to invest in offshore wind. We need to continue our links with Europe, which will become more difficult if we leave the EU. We need to ban fracking and new coal. There's a whole, and we need to plant more trees. And I give credit to the Scottish government that they do have a big program, but we need a massive program of planting more trees. And what about a national citizens climate assembly and a new green investment bank? Thank you.
I'm glad that BIFAB's become part of the conversation. Clearly, people are reading our leaflets, and it's leading the conversation. I'll try and actually stick to the question, because if we get talking about environmental issues, well, the environment is only the world and everything in it. The question was specifically about subsidy of oil and gas, so I'll keep it to that. Renewable funding, people tend to think, how are we going to fund this? Where's this magic money tree coming from? Well, for a start, stop subsidising risky investment in oil and gas. It halved in price about 10 years ago, and it has not recovered to that since. It's a dying fuel. It's a fossil fuel. We need to leave it in the ground. No nuclear weapons. Again, Trident is a massive expenditure that the UK doesn't need and can never actually use. It's a further investment in risk. Again, I just personally don't understand it. Pension funds, another thing. Billions sit in, invested in fossil fuel companies and arms companies that if you told the average person that works for a local authority would not believe that's where their pension fund was being invested in. Along with the potential in independent Scotland for a green investment bank. The Scottish National Investment Bank certainly do that once it has capital funding from the Scottish Government. And I think the way we structure our energy systems going forward, it's so important that we don't just replace oil and gas multinationals for a bunch of renewable multinationals. Clearly, those don't benefit ordinary people. When we see that just transition, the savings in energy have to be passed on to the consumer, not hoarded off for the profit of billionaires. The long-term transition to a green economy should have started 20 years ago. We're now pressed. We have 10 years. We have until 2030 to reach net zero emissions. That's our party policy, because it's guided by science. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, demand this isn't some choice. It shouldn't be a philosophical matter. We're guided by science. We need to meet those obligations. If you want green investment, if you want a green economy, vote green on December the 12th. Thanks.
Hi there, I'd like to go slightly off topic, if that's okay with everybody. I'd just like to thank everybody on the panel for coming tonight. Great answers for everybody, and I really don't know who I'm going to vote for. I tell you, it's really hung. But when voters are looking at prospective candidates in an election, they look at many things about a candidate to make their choice on who they'll vote for. But I think one of the main things for me, and I believe for many, is trusting what they say and to be transparent in their roles while representing constituents and show tact and forethought in their handling of issues on behalf of the electorate. Mossmorran, pardon the pun, is a burning issue in Cowdenbeath. What are the panellists' opinions on reports of some councillors who have taken free gifts and had the odd wee night out on Exxon's shilling, while at the same time being responsible from time to time for holding the plant to account on pollution issues on behalf of the constituents? Regardless of registering these jollies on the list of members' interests, do the panel members think it's an acceptable thing for councillors to do when local people are looking for strong, transparent representation on these matters, as anyone doing so could be viewed as being less than impartial and possibly not fit to represent people? What's the panel's view on the importance of trust, impartiality and the acceptance of free gifts while in office? Do you think it's a wise thing to do? Is it acceptable? Should it be frowned upon, or should it be banned?
I think it's appalling. I think at any level of government, whether you're a councillor, an MSP, MEP, there needs to absolutely be accountability about who's buying your dinners if it's not you. The fact that it exists just seems bewildering to me. There should be no gifts in office. It should be banned. There is legislation coming forward in the Scottish Parliament, potentially, that will stop MSPs taking a second job. Absolutely, that should be the case. If you're on 58 grand a year, do you need a weekend job? Do you need someone to do in the evenings? I would imagine not. You should be serving your constituents and nothing else. I've worked in care most of my life, so the thought of getting something for free is kind of beyond me. I think maybe this is probably a question for Kathleen, so I'll pass the microphone along to her.
Thank you. Yes, I thought this was probably a question for myself.
Yes, I have on 2 occasions. I will explain those. I've never tried to keep either of them secret. I attended last year the Royal Military Tattoo in Edinburgh, which were tickets that were provided by ExxonMobil, where I had dinner, correct. The second event that I went to was a Burns supper. At the Burns supper, there was cross-party representation from MPs, MSPs and councillors. At the Burns supper, as at the event in Edinburgh, I can be quite clear what I actually had in terms of what the gift was as such. I had dinner at both of those. I had a vegetarian dish and I had mineral water, as I don't drink when I am driving. That's what both of the events were. At the second event, at the Burns supper, which was cross-party invites, it actually gave me quite a good opportunity that evening to speak to a number of people from Exxon, but also 1 or 2 from Shell who were in attendance there, because 2 weeks after that I was actually attending a conference, a STEM conference, and it was particularly about, I spoke about this earlier, about getting girls into STEM subjects, and it actually gave me the opportunity to speak to people about that, because it was an area that I didn't actually know very much about. In terms of whether or not gifts are acceptable, does it not make you impartial? I'm not going to be bribed for a vegetarian haggis, that's very clear. I'm certainly not going to be swayed one way or another by going to a dinner. There were no other gifts other than those. Sorry?
What about the tattoo?
What about the tattoo?
Well, 50 quid a ticket, tickets for that as well.
That's correct.
Yeah. Well, you said the dinner, but you went to the tattoo as well, as part of it.
That was part of it, yes.
Alright, so you're counting that as the one?
It was one event, yes, that's how it's registered, yes, that's correct.
And how about with Davison next week? She's an MSP, and next week she's going to have a second job with IPN, I think it is, the analyst on election night. How does that compare with having a neutral panel and you have an MSP former leader of the Scottish Conservative Party sitting on a panel discussing postal votes, perhaps?
Well, first of all, she won't be the first elected representative to do that, and secondly, I can't speak on behalf of Ruth Davidson.
What's your opinion?
What's my opinion on it?
Ruth Davidson working that night of having a second job?
If that's something that she has agreed to do, and that's concluded with the Scottish Conservative Party, and there's no conflict of interest in terms of her role as an MSP, then I would have no problem with it.
Does that go for everybody that you could take in?
What do you mean in terms of everybody?
Well, anybody from an opposition party, to get the same thing would apply to them. It's up to them then, if they want to do that.
Provided they clear that with a political party and there's no conflict of interest, yes, I wouldn't have an issue with it.
Can I just say, I worked in the NHS for a good number of years, and we couldn't at the end even accept a pen or a notebook or anything in case it was misconstrued and anything ever went to a court of law or anything like that. You have to keep yourself clean at all times, not even a pen. So the fact that you're just making it flippant about having had dinner, got your tattoo, that's actually accountable. I can, if anything one of this happens, post a court of law, that can be misconstrued as accepting gifts, no matter what the value is.
I'm not actually denying it was that. I have, like I said, it's on my register of interest. It's a public record.
Will you take more?
Sorry?
Will you go to the next one tonight, even though your community is against it?
I've not, first of all, I've not been invited to another Burns night.
Know that the community is against it.
All the community.
I don't know anybody who's in agreement with it.
Does it have to be all? Well, it doesn't matter. If there's people within the community that are against it, surely you're representing them as well.
Indeed, well, I'll make that decision at the time.
Curiosity, do you think it's a conflict of interest when Mossmorran and BFB safety FDAs would commit a housekeeping council? Or do you think that's acceptable?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Helen said. I started my training in the Vic in the early 80s, and I worked in the NHS for over 25 years. And as a nurse, any kind of monetary gift was absolutely not on the table. You know, it's a serious breach of trust. It has a monetary value. It's counted as a monetary gift. It's got a monetary value. And so, you know, that's something that is very clear in my mind, and I think, well, I don't think, I know that I can be transparent and honest. But I think the point that Kathleen's missing, I would suggest, is that nobody really cares what was on the menu, and nobody really cares what she ate. Everybody cares about the principle of a perception that you would be more favourable to the sponsor than you would likely be if the gift hadn't been made. And we're not talking about, you know, a couple of tickets to go to the tattoo. It is, as I understand it, it's not something I have done. I understand it, it's quite a luxury experience that you have in a very private area within the tattoo. So we're not talking, that's my understanding, that we're not talking a couple of tickets. And if it is a couple of tickets, you know what? MPs have got a lot of money. They get a really big salary. And to be frank,
I'm not an MP.
no, I'm not. I'm talking about this position. MPs have seriously enough money. I think the last pay rise was obscene. Certainly in time of austerity, and I don't see any reason why an MP wouldn't be able to buy their own tickets, and if they want to have a special experience in a private box, then they can pay for that, because certainly if anybody offered me something like that, I would be wanting to raffle it to somebody in the community who would never have the opportunity to have that experience. I'd much rather they had it than I would. That would give me much more pleasure.
One supper that Kathleen attended,
Also in attendance was Peter Grant MP, Councillor Fiona Grant, Councillor Danny Hogan, and Alexander Stewart MSP.
I'm speaking entirely for myself, sir.
Yes,
I'm speaking entirely for myself.
So you'd be just as critical of Peter Grant and Fiona Grant for attending that, would you?
I'm not going to speak for anybody else. It's not a simple question. I've made my point very clear, and I'm not going to answer any further.
I've only been in politics since 2012. I previously worked in industry up until that point. We had very strict rules when I worked in industry, probably not as strict perhaps as the example of the health service, but there were very strict rules as part of our contract of employment about not accepting gifts, and if you took anything, it had to be, if somebody handed you in a box of chocolates at the end of the year, you normally share that with the rest of your teammates anyway. There was nothing very, lush or expensive. That wasn't the culture, and nobody expected it. When I became a councillor in 2012, obviously there's a whole set of procedures that as councillors you have to observe in terms of things that you do and duties you perform and how that's declared. And that's a national system. I think part of the conflict I found was when I became the economy spokesperson, then as your role has a certain duty, you quite often have to attend what I would call official functions as part of that role. So the provost probably has that similar dilemma where you are representing the role. So I think it needs to be understood, but clearly the onus was on all public servants, whether MPs, MSPs or councillors, to make sure that they're open and transparent in declaring that. I think the second thing I would say is that I think there is just a culture of difference from where people used to see that as okay and where people see that now. And I think it's incumbent on everyone to recognise that change in culture. As an MP, again, in part of my previous roles, you do get invited to lots of things. Within Parliament, there are stuff on every single night. But most of those are around information events, hosted by charities very often. And it's probably fair to say that across the whole of Parliament, across all parties, everyone does attend those. But I think there's a very subtle difference about accepting gifts that I think people in the public, that you're there to represent would consider, why are you doing that? And I think if it's raising that question, then you have to consider, I think the culture has just changed. And that maybe says you do need to change things. Scott talked about second jobs. I don't believe anyone should have a second job. If you're not busy enough doing the job that we've got, then frankly, you're not doing it right. And that's why I would support Neil Finlay. It's Neil Finlay's bill. With regards to Ruth Davidson, I do think it's a conflict of interest. So as a senior politician in the Labour Party, I get invited onto lots of events. I don't charge a fee for that. I never ask for a fee for that. And I think Ruth has set, frankly, a bit of an unusual precedent here. And I think other colleagues would be puzzled by that. But all I can say is encourage your MSPs to support Neil Finlay's bill going through the Scottish Parliament. And that way we won't be having the culture of second jobs. And we can all focus on representing you, because that's what we're here to do.
Not a lot to add. The rules for councillors are very clear that anything we get should be declared. Everybody's disappearing for some reason. I will also say to you that I too was invited to go to the tattoo. I had a meal, and that was courtesy of the army, because in my ward we have the Lucas Army Station. I do a lot of work with them, and I was invited to go 2 or 3 years ago by one of the senior officers who I'd done a lot of work with. I value that relationship, and I think that my local community values that relationship as well. So yes, I obviously went to the same thing that Kathleen went to. The thing here is it needs to be open so people can see and they draw their own conclusions, but you have to be extremely careful, and that's almost the only thing I can think of that I've accepted.
Is the army contentious in your community? do they have the kind of same issues that residents here are facing from ExxonMobil?
No, it is a very different situation. The Army are very much part of the community, and they work with the community, support the community. You know, they use obviously the shops, the businesses. They're a key part of our community. Although there are some issues occasionally on a Friday or a Saturday night, but not very often.
The other thing that I think some of the panel are missing is that us normal folks, we think that a big business lays out a bit of a do because it works. And we don't know who does it work with. So if you go to these things, how do we know you were one of the ones it worked on or the ones it didn't work on? That's why it's seen by us mortals as how foolish. Because we know big business are making plenty of money. So, you know, you need to think that we're not quite as daft as you might think we are. Thank you.
Okay, we're almost at the end of the night, so we'll keep it with quite a light-hearted and quick question. And this, rubber law. Gosh, sorry there. Okay, Google's settled. Is rubber law here tonight? Okay, well, his question is, should Exxon listen to the First Minister and respect the local communities by delaying its start-up flaring, which is always extreme, until after Christmas and New Year's holidays?
James, could I just come in there? I was at a meeting yesterday with Exxon, sorry for some councillor Campbell who represents Cowdenbeath, and Mossmorran obviously we have used up at the week. And I was with Jacob, the plant manager, and there will be no start-up flaring until after January.
Well, I think that's it, folks. Can we questions answered? Thank you, Alec. Can we thank all the candidates for... Just one last final thing. Can we thank all the candidates for showing up? We did engage... The only candidate not to finally respond was Mitch Williams. We've had no contact with him whatsoever. But thanks again to the 5 candidates and good luck for the election. Thank you.